Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. 73 years after the Nazi regime, Germany has visible far right again. In today's episode, we will take a closer look at this movement and the threat it may pose to Jews in Germany. I'm Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and a daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I emigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller. I am the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust Theater Project, thinedgeofthewedge.com. I grew up in the town of Elgin, Illinois, a small Midwestern town in which the Jewish community, one synagogue, did not have Holocaust survivors. Our parents and grandparents had come at the turn of the 20th century to escape the Tsar and other pogroms. And yet in September 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust, my U.S. Army officer husband and I found ourselves stationed in Munich, Germany, and this changed our lives forever.
Dr. Remko Leemhuis is the director of the American Jewish Committee in Berlin. His areas of focus include contemporary anti-Semitism, Islamism, and security policy. He's also committed to strengthening the transatlantic relationship as well as German-Israeli relations. Remko Leemhuis studied political and Oriental studies at the Phillips University of Marburg and the University of Berkeley, California. Remko, it's great to have you on our show. Welcome, and thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you both for hosting me. Hi, Phyllis. Hi, Evelyn. And a special shout out to Evelyn for pronouncing my surname very precise. That doesn't happen often to me.
That's the European connection. Anyway, today I get to ask the first question, which is, what is your personal connection to the work you do at AJC in Berlin?
So I was an intern at the AJC Berlin office in 2007 while I was still studying, and so that I guess indicates that I was interested in the issues that AJC dealt back then with, and we're still sadly dealing with. But I'm not Jewish, so I don't have in that sense, personal connection to the work that I do. But I was an intern, and when I moved to Berlin around 10 years ago, I started working part-time at the office while I was writing my PhD, which I wrote on the German Foreign Office and its relationship to Israel between the Six-Day War and Camp David. And well, since then, I'm proudly working for AJC.
Why were you an intern when you were still studying? What led you to walk in the door in the first place?
Well, it was it started off with an interest in German history even before I went to university, and especially an interest into the history of the Third Reich, the history of the Shoah. And when I started at the university, I also got interested into the Middle East. So this was a time around the start of the Second Intifada and September, so 9/11, and it was at this point that when you looked at Islamist propaganda, you could see sort of echoes of when you look at anti-Semitism, for example, that it is not so different from National Socialist anti-Semitism or the anti-Semitism in the Third Reich. So, and somehow these topics sort of merged for me together at that point, and that's why I then got interested into the Middle East and Israel, and that then ultimately led me, I applied for an internship at the AJC office in Berlin.
It's amazing that you recognized the similarity, the totalitarianism, right, of Islamism and Nazism. Is that correct? That's what you saw?
Yeah, exactly. So that's
Yeah.
so it's sort of mostly it's hard to explain to people who are sort of not familiar with the topics when I say, that because I was interested in in German history, as I said before, I went to university as a student, and also had a lot of events and met a lot of survivors back then. I mean, this is now 20 years ago or more, so there were more survivors that came to our school, or there were in other settings where we had events with them. So yeah, and again, and then I saw the parallels sort of between these two ideologies, and also then and that was also then the link to Israel and why Israel is necessary and why there's a necessity for a Jewish state. And so yeah, that's sort of the how it merged together in my head.
I understand. So in December, it was world news that thousands of German police officers and special forces were involved in stopping a far-right extremist plot to violently overthrow the German government. Which movement was behind this plot?
So the arrested people, or the suspects, not everyone was arrested. There were about 25 people who were arrested, and some of them are still in custody. They belong to the so-called Reichsbürger movement, which you can loosely translate as citizens of the Reich. As the name indicates, they are supporters of the German monarchy that ceased to exist in 1918. And they simultaneously don't believe in the existence of the Federal Republic of Germany. And for example, they claim that there was never a peace treaty after the Second World War, that Germany is still an occupied country, and some of them also think that Germany is a company, and therefore they don't accept the Federal Republic and the laws of the Federal Republic. And some of them even proclaim their own sort of states on their private property, give out passports, or even their own currencies, some of them. And they, in some cases, also refuse to pay taxes, and in the past have attacked employees of the state, and especially police officers. And in the most recent raid, they allegedly, according to the judge who signed off on it, they plan to overthrow the federal government and reinstate the monarchy. And among those arrested was a former member of parliament from the far-right Alternative for Germany party, a retired German special forces soldier, as well as an opera singer and a gourmet chef. So a rather weird ragtag band of people. And I know that all sounds absurd, the ideology and the set of people, but we at AGC constantly highlight the fact that even though when you look at this, sometimes you think, oh, this is so strange, it's almost funny, what they believe in, that they are still in fact dangerous, especially given the fact that a lot of them legally own firearms and have used them in the past. For example, in southern Germany in 2016, there was a case when a follower of this Reichsbürger movement shot a police officer when the police tried to confiscate his weapons. So they are dangerous. But I mean, it's needless to say, obviously they wouldn't have overthrown the government. And it was a discussion here in Germany that then some people sort of belittled it and said, like, well, you know, these 50 people, they would have never overthrown the government. I mean, of course, they would have never overthrown the government. But that doesn't diminish the fact that they are dangerous, because given their ideology, given their access to weapon and their affinity to weapons, it is very concerning that even if they don't overthrow the government, they are still able, you know, to commit terror attacks. And if you look, for example, even though both of them were not exactly follower of this ideology, but if you look at the terror attack in Halle against, where, you know, the right-wing terror attack against a synagogue on Yom Kippur, and the racist mass shooting in Hanau a year later or a few months later, these people also had at least like parts of you know, or were like, you know, part of this ideology also played into their, you know, motives for their terror attacks. So that is why, you know, we stress that don't diminish it, don't laugh it off, take this seriously, and obviously, given that that they're right-wing extremists, anti-Semitism is at the core of their beliefs, and so the Jewish community is especially at risk. Jewish community, Jewish institutions are especially at risk from these people.
So they are also anti-Semitic, is what you say?
Absolutely, absolutely. That is at the core of their belief system, with all the conspiracy theories that you could see all over, you know, the extreme right, you know, the whole Western world. So, you know, maybe
we'll go into that later
yeah.
on, and what exactly those beliefs are.
Yes.
Phyllis?
Yes. So we know the far right movements are growing in Germany, but what is the reason for this? Can you explain this to our audience?
So I guess one reason is the polarization of society, and the polarization that we see all over the Western world and in all democracies. And I guess, you know, your listeners also know this from the US, that this polarization radicalizes people. And this is also something interesting when you look at this Reichsbürger movement. These are sometimes people that, you know, for decades have lived a very normal life. And all of a sudden, you know, in the span of 6 months or so, they are you know, deeply radicalized, deeply anti-Semitic, deeply, you know, believing in this conspiracy theories. And so this polarization, and in Germany, this polarization is especially an issue when we talk about the far right, because it began with the arrival of the mostly refugees from the Middle East, mostly Syria, in 2015, and the debates about immigration, integration, and this was sort of, you know, in the German context, you know, it is a very vital, you know, point of this friction society and this polarization in Germany.
And how large would you say, or of the entire German population, what percentage do you think really believes in these, you know, how big is the threat?
So if we look at the, you know, the general population, we see very consistently, and we put out a survey last year in May. So anti-Semitic beliefs in Germany are shared by, again, it depends on, you know, what questions are, you know, the setting of the study. It's qualitative, but somewhere between 25 and 35% of Germans hold anti-Semitic belief. That doesn't mean that they have a, you know, closed anti-Semitic mindset. It just means that, you know, they agree, you know, with one or two anti-Semitic tropes. So we have a huge problem with anti-Semitism in mainstream society. And of course, the fringes, and you know, we're talking about the right wing in this case. Again, you know, they are obviously very deeply anti-Semitic.
What age does Holocaust education begin in Germany?
That's pretty hard to tell because since Germany is a federal state like the US, so education policy lies with the state. So it depends in which state you are living that when this education starts. But I would say around the age of 13 or 14, I think is the first time that people or children are introduced into the history of the Third Reich and the Holocaust.
But it is mandated, even though it's at different ages. Is that correct? Across the
Yes,
country.
it is on every curriculum in every state in Germany. There is not sort of formal mandate, but it is on every curriculum. And I don't know of a state where this is not part of the curriculum of every school.
Thank you.
So back to the far right. And we haven't really defined what we call right or what we call far right, or what we call extreme right. But what you're saying is the part of the right at the right that holds anti-Semitic beliefs in Germany is substantial. Is that correct? Did I understand that well?
Yes.
Okay. What are the beliefs of these people in Germany about Jews?
So here I would sort of differentiate between the old school neo-Nazi right-wing extremist and what I would call the modern right and the modern new right extremist. And I'll explain the difference. So when you look at for example, there are parties like that is actually called the right, or other small parties. They don't play a role in election, but we also have beside these very openly right-wing extremist parties, there are also neo-Nazi organization in very different shapes or forms, and I would call these sort of the old right-wing extremists because they openly see themselves as sort of in the tradition of the National Socialism. They are very openly anti-Semitic, although I have to say, for especially listeners in the US, for example, it is a crime in Germany to deny the Holocaust. So there are certain limits on what they can say, but to the extent that it's legal, they are very openly anti-Semitic, and it is very easy to spot. Now, when I look at what I would call the new right, or the more modernized version of right-wing extremism, it is a bit more complicated. And if I take, for example, the Alternative for Germany, the party that I've mentioned before, who's also in the Bundestag, in the German parliament, there is more complicated because, for example, the Alternative for Germany, like other right-wing populist parties in Europe, they portray themselves as staunch supporters of Israel and the best friends of the Jewish community. But if you scratch at the surface, it is very clear that anti-Semitism is also at the core of their ideology, even though they try to camouflage it and they try to hide it. So they talk about, for example, a globalist financial elite that is running the world. So obviously they don't say Jews, but everyone understands, the trope and what they mean by that. There are also sort of, George Soros is a huge issue. So the Jewish philanthropist, that's a huge issue for them, accusing him of flooding Europe and Germany with migrants as a sort of sinister plan of replacing the native German population. And so these are more camouflaged, more, they try to hide their anti-Semitism, but it's still at their, at the center of their beliefs. And they are, and they're also, in my opinion, two reasons why that is, why they are not openly anti-Semitic. And I think it's mere tactics. So first of all, being openly anti-Semitic, still would, shy away or scare away, a certain, percentage of the electorate, or would scare away right-wing conservative voters who might agree on other issues. But, again, for a lot of people, openly anti-Semitism would be a red line, even though if they would, agree with other, of the main issues of the party. And also, when they talk about anti-Semitism, they only talk about anti-Semitism emanating from the Muslim community and using it as a tool for the racist and anti-refugee, anti-immigrant propaganda. So that's where I would say is a distinction.
Yeah, if I look at the Netherlands, which I know much better than Germany, I know of two populist parties. There are a few very small ones in addition to that now, but the two bigger ones, one has issues with anti-Semitism internally, and the other one has not at all. I, so the picture I have is, yes, there is anti-Semitism at the far right, but not everybody, not every party in Europe in that corner has anti-Semitism obviously there, and not every person identifying with that with those parties is by definition anti-Semitic. But you will find anti-Semitism at the far right, and you're saying it's substantial at the far right in Germany.
What I wanted to clarify is the Bundestag is a German parliament. How many seats does the Alternative for Germany have? I remember when they got enough seats to have offices throughout all your states, I was horrified. Because as I told you earlier, I had seen their posters in 2016 in Berlin where they were basically nothing. And suddenly they got how many seats? What's the percentage of the parliament?
So they now currently have 78 seats out of, oh, you got me here, around 600, I guess close to 700 seats that the German parliament has overall.
But 78 seats is a lot.
78 is a lot, yes.
As we can, you'll correct me on the exact number. Hitler's party won when he was installed on January 30th, 1933, with less 30-something% of the German parliament at that time. So I just want to remind our viewers here in America that 78 seats can make a big difference.
Yes. But again, as I said, not all of those seats will have anti-Semitic beliefs. At least in Holland, that would be the case. Is that the same in Germany?
Well, I mean, I would say we have seen a radicalization of the Alternative for Germany over the past years. I would say 5 years ago, I would have agreed that there were still, I would say, traditionally, right of center or more right of center conservatives. But over the past years, we have seen a steady and increasingly, radicalization of the party, especially in Eastern Germany, where there are people heading the party in state legislators and or head of the party in certain states who are clearly right-wing extremists. So I'm at a point where I would say that people who are still sort of member of the parliament in Germany for the Alternative for Germany, they are right-wing extremists. Although I don't know every single person. I have obviously I don't know, and we as AJC don't interact with them. We don't talk to them. So, but again, given how this party is radicalized, it begs the question, if people see that and are a member of the party and, if, are still fine with that, then I would say then they should live with the accusations that they are a member of a far right or far right extremist party.
Is this the AfD and the smaller parties at the right, and movements, not always parties, the movements, including the AfD, what are their beliefs about democracy?
Well, I mean, they are as I guess it's the same, in the US or across the Western world or Western Europe or in Europe in general, they are anti-democratic by nature. They obviously want to abolish democracy because they don't believe in the values and the procedures and the institutions of liberal democracy. They clearly reject human rights and universal human rights and the idea that all people are equal. And as everywhere, they are, as we have already talked about, they are anti-Semitic, they are racist, they are sexist, they are homophobic, they're against immigration, and so I guess there's, in that sense, nothing unusual about the German far right that you wouldn't find, for example, in the US on the far right or in comparable or similar movements or parties.
Is it?
So it is a part of populism. Then it's not all of populism, because what you just the categories of hatred you just mentioned are not in all populist, in the whole populist movement, but parts of it do have these beliefs, and that's the same in Germany? Or would you say all of the populism in Germany has all these racist beliefs?
I mean, obviously, there's also a populism on the left, so populism isn't confined to the right. But if we talk about populist movements on the right, I would definitely say this is part of their ideology and core beliefs. To what extent? I mean, then you have to really look at case by case. But as a general rule, I would say this applies to right-wing populism in Germany and to sort of every stream of right-wing populism in Germany.
Why is it seems to be much stronger in East Germany? Is that a leftover from being under Soviet occupation for so long but that's my opinion, but I don't see quite how that turned to B. Do you see what I'm asking?
Well, that's a very hard question, to be honest, because there are obviously a lot of factors about there is and this is not a excuse and not meant as an excuse. So I'm just talking analytically, and obviously it is a part of Germany that is economically not very well off. The GDR was more or less, encircled in an island, so there weren't a lot of foreigners, immigrants. There were some, immigrants or working immigrants from other socialist countries, but they were also confined to to certain spaces where they lived, so there wasn't much of an interaction with foreigners, and so these are some of the reasons why. And after after the reunification, West German neo-Nazis very deliberately and very strategically sort of moved to the eastern part of Germany and established sort of footholds in different parts and different cities. And there was always also a neo-Nazi scene in the GDR, which of course the GDR never admitted, because by definition the GDR was an anti-fascist state, so right. There couldn't be any neo-Nazis. And I guess there's also some again, all of this isn't really explaining the whole phenomenon, but during the GDR, being a neo-Nazi was, again, given that the GDR defined itself as a anti-fascist country, the most radical opposition that you could have against the state. And so I would say these are, again, not all the factors and not all the,
right.
It is a huge discussion. But your observation is right that the right is much stronger in Eastern Germany, especially when you look at the Alternative for Germany. They are in some states, they are at this point polling as the strongest party if there would be a election on Sunday. So it is very troubling.
So should the German government do more about these alt-right movements?
Of course, the government could always do more, but I'm skeptical of always looking to the state or government institution to solve this problem. I mean, this ultimately, mainstream society has to fight this problem and has to take on this problem. But of course, there are always things that the state and government institutions could do. For example, as I said, these Reichsbürger movement, a lot of these people legally own weapons. And just for the US listeners, we already have very, very strict gun laws in Germany, but I think you could still, tighten these laws and, make them even harsher. For example, if someone, authorities are aware of extremist views and, extremist views are documented, that even though they are legally owning these firearms, that they are taken away from them, obviously in a due process manner. But this is something that needs to be done, and this is also something that is discussed at the moment in Germany and in the Ministry of Interior, because they understand that this combination of these extremist beliefs plus access to weapons obviously is a problem.
So what can regular German citizens and the Jewish community do to help block what's growing in Germany in terms of the alt-right?
I mean, as I said, and that is maybe not a very convincing, or very interesting answer. It is to speak up, to address this issue, and first and foremost speak up when it happens, when you are with members of your family, or at the workplace, or in social settings. And it doesn't have to be a grand organization or anything, but to be aware of these issues and to be aware that this is an issue. And if you hear something anti-Semitic, if you hear something racist, that you speak up and call it out. And I wouldn't say that. So again, I guess I wouldn't say that the Jewish community per se has a particular role to play. I mean, obviously they are most likely the victims of these right-wing extremists, but and obviously are interested and are fighting against right-wing extremism. But I would say the main burden is on mainstream society. And I mean, in the past, for example, all major Jewish institutions and organizations, for example, have called out the AfD and have said this is not a this is a right-wing party, and have denounced their ideology and their support that they have voiced for the Jewish community, their so-called support. So this is something that has happened a few times over the past years, that all major and all relevant Jewish institutions came together and denounced the Alternative for Germany. And I guess it goes without saying that everything further to the right, also is,
Evelyn?
not acceptable.
do far right extremist groups, who would use violence in Germany, do they have links with like-minded groups outside Germany?
Yes. One example, so this is again not a strict organization, but during the COVID protest that we had in Germany, so the protest against the measures that the state took to stop the spread of the virus. And I guess you've seen this also in the US, and then these anti-vaxxer protests. Interestingly, QAnon was, and this belief system of QAnon was picked up very, very soon after it emerged in the US, and in no other Western European country had QAnon such a resonance as in Germany, for example. So you could see that people radicalize over the internet, even though maybe there are no personal ties at this point. And there's another example of the so-called Atomwaffen division, so atomic weapon division. And that is also something that emanated from the US, but they also had followers here, and that's an extremely dangerous, extremely violent, and again, also with access to weapons. And we could also see just within Europe that right-wing extremists cooperate, that they cross borders. Of course, when you're a European citizen and you are in the European Union, you can just travel back and forth in every European country without being checked at any border. And so most visibly, we see this at demonstrations. For example, there are sometimes, important demonstrations once a year in Poland, where you see a lot of German neo-Nazis. Similar things in Hungary. In February, there's always a huge neo-Nazi demonstration, for example, in Dresden, commemorating the bombing of the city during the Second World War. There you can then see right-wing extremists from other European countries. So of course there is a huge degree of cooperation.
We talked about just a few minutes ago about what listeners can do at the individual level. Do you have any additional information that you would like to share with people about that? And this is also your chance for last word.
Well, I would say I don't want to make this an advertisement about AJC, but we compiled a sort of brochure with anti-Semitic tropes that you can download and look into, and where it is explained what this means and this codes, and decoding these anti-Semitic stereotypes. So educate yourself. Listen to what the victims have to say, because this is also often overlooked, that these debates are then about these issues without including the victims and the perspective of the victims. And this is something that, it should go without saying, but it doesn't often. And take this seriously, and don't brush it off, because when we talk about anti-Semitism, and I'm here talking about Germany, but I guess it also applies for other countries, not every anti-Semitic incident is a crime. So we also have to deal, there's also a huge level and amount of everyday anti-Semitism that doesn't meet the threshold of a crime, but that still, makes life hard. And this is something we need to talk more about. And luckily in Germany, we have organizations who track these incidents now, so that we have a better understanding of that. And so just to have an awareness of the fact that anti-Semitism doesn't start with a crime or with a physical assault, but that it starts earlier, and that it needs to be called out, and that people shouldn't be shy calling it out. And I guess that's something that everyone can do.
Yes, the Claims Conference slogan, "It starts with words," or it started with words, I think, is really important. We don't
Yeah,
have to
absolutely.
wait. That's why my play Thin Edge of the Wedge. It's a British expression. It means the wedge gets so large it's too hard to turn back. So we must not wait till it's a crime. We have to start sooner. And I want to especially thank you. At this point, we always thank our guests, but we threw you some hardballs. I mean, you were fabulous because this is such a complicated and multi-leveled conversation, and 30 to 40 minutes. We didn't give you a lot of time, but you were fabulous. And I think really, and I think our listeners, for those of you who have not yet seen Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, I urge you to see it. It fills in a lot of some of the stuff we're talking about today. You can see it on Amazon or YouTube. You can read more about my play at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we close every session saying, without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up against all anti-Semitism and all hate.